just to pick up on what Francis was saying earlier, he was saying that you cannot get anybody to argue in favor of prohibition. It is surprisingly true. I'm an editor of a journal. I always try to get somebody to provide me with a paper, an intelligent defense of prohibition. It's very difficult to do. Not that there aren't many people out there. There are many. There's the Drug-Free America Foundation. There's the Pope. There are many people who hold a prohibitionist position. Is it intelligent? Is it progressive? And this is the interesting thing, because when prohibition first started in the late 19th, early 20th century, it was a progressive issue. The people who were in favor of banning alcohol, the members of the Temperance League, and the people who were against the opium trade in China, were all people who wanted to address social ills. And they were fighting big industry, the breweries, the alcohol trusts, and so on. The politicians were reluctant. They did not want to take this on board. And this is interesting how this has been completely inverted, because now it's the drug policy reformers who are the so-called progressives, or whatever the equivalence is. And the people who are defending the system are sort of, as was said earlier, usually have a vested interest in it. So I think the social ills are now very much associated with the drug control system as we know it. And in the scenario planning, we can start fantasizing. What would it be like if we got rid of it? You know, I mean, there is a sort of tendency to sort of slip into utopianism. It's very similar to what happened when alcohol got prohibited in the US with the Volstead Act in 1919. People thought that crime was going to disappear, and in some towns in the southern US, the council sold off their prisons because there would not be any more need for crime. So I thought, you know, this sort of utopianism is part of the prohibitionist faith, perhaps. And let's equally indulge a bit. What can we do in a post-prohibitionist scenario? What would happen? But first to do so, let us remind ourselves, what are the harms that are allegedly associated with drugs? And let's go to the UK drug strategy, no better place. And what we can read from there is there are two things that come out of it, crime and health. So let's look at them a bit more closely in the next one. So according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the international drugs trade takes up something like 320 billion. I mean, remarkable figures that are sort of only in the dimension of banking scandals and bankruptcies. But it's said to be the third largest commodity trade. Even though this is pretty ropey, because most drug traffickers do not post their accounts with the tax office. So we estimate this via various sort of ways of extrapolating from street prices to production figures and so on. But the important thing is that for many organized crime groups, the drug trade is the #1 source of revenue. And, you know, nasty groups like Mexican crime cartels also diversify into kidnapping and extortion rackets. But the biggest moneymaker is drugs. And the Serious and Organized Crime Agency in the UK, for instance, if you go to their website, they list the fight against Class A drug importation and the organized crime groups that are involved in this as their #1 priority. You could almost say without organized drug crime, no Serious and Organized Crime Agency, but that would be going too far, perhaps. We also know from the study by the Matrix Knowledge Group with drug dealers in this country that entering the drugs trade in itself is not very difficult. What really helps is having a criminal CV, time spent in prison, for instance, where you also make the contacts. But if you want to get more profitably involved, you need capital. And we also know this from NSIS, the National Crime Intelligence Service, that there's a whole range of crime that's committed by people, property crime, bank robberies and muggings and so on, in order to get the capital to get involved in the drugs trade. And all of it, what this suggests, that if you had a regulated, licit drugs market, that crime, that organized crime, would go away. Let's just remember how it works. Cocaine, a kilo of cocaine trades in Venezuela or Colombia for $1,000 to $3,000 US. Once it gets to the West Coast, it's said to be $120,000. In the UK, it's £40,000. And it's this premium that people who risk themselves, risk their liberty, their limbs, their lives, trading in it, that's what they take. Because the demand is there and the market will supply it. And we also have to remember that the violence, as was mentioned earlier, the violence involved in it is largely because the trade is below the law. So if you have a dispute because my dealer has supplied me with some dodgy powder, I can't go to court to settle it, I have to use my own methods. The violence also ripples through it because it comes from the state. The state penalizes people by arresting and incarcerating them. And very often in the course of arrest, as we've just heard, a lot of violence is used. So it's the state that prompts this whole chain of violence that leads to shootings and killings right across. There's nothing inherent in the commodities themselves. Cannabis or opium are no more inherently violent producing than tea or saccharin, all of which are commodities which did cause a lot of trafficking and violence associated with it when the tax levels were very high. So the high costs of drugs and the accompanying criminality are the outcomes of policy. And it's not, as often as argued by advocates, the reasons why such policy is put into place. So once the drug trade is regulated, we can assume that organized crime groups will be eliminated, and we can also assume that the price will fall dramatically, because these are pretty basic substances. They're crops, cash crops. Let us just remember that we have other highly addictive substances that are legally available, but nobody ever gets mugged because somebody wants to fuel a nicotine habit, because the prices are low enough for you to be able to afford it from begging if you have to. So if you go to the other one, the other idea is health, the other dimension. And the fall in prices that we anticipate from a regulated drug market will, of course, prompt changes in drug-using behavior. There will perhaps, for instance, be no more need for injecting substances because it's a valuable substance, very expensive, and you're trying to maximize the gain from it. But you can get it now from smoking it or from inhaling the stuff. We can also anticipate that drug purity will rise in a regulated market. And that means that people will know what they're getting. Could we have the next slide, please? And which means that drug-related deaths, or what we know as overdoses, would to a large extent vanish. And this is the studies from St. George's Hospital, where they studied drug-related deaths, and something like 80% are accidental suicides, as they're called, because people do not know what the strength is of what they're injecting into them. We also can assume that once the legislation on drug-using paraphernalia has been removed, particularly things like needles and the cooking equipment, that many of the infectious diseases, particularly HIV and hepatitis C and B and so on, will no longer be as rampant as they are now in drug-using populations. We can also assume that the removal of the stigma will lead to a fall in the mental health conditions that are associated with drug use and so on. And these are global advantages that will affect every country that introduces a regulated market. There are also particular sort of financial gains, and there are two sources. One is the savings that we can achieve by dismantling the criminal justice system. And this is particularly sort of pertinent, I suppose, here in the UK, that we're talking about reducing the police budget by 20%. And we can actually do so because we're investing in so many wasteful activities. If you look at the prison system, for instance, I must apologize, it's a bit dated now, 5 years old. I think it hasn't changed much, but something like 13.6% of people incarcerated in the UK are there for drug offences, not drug-related offences, drug offences. We could take all of these out and create the capacity in a prison system which many say is terribly overcrowded. What about police time? Well, this is the amount of police time that is generated by stops and searches. There were 536,000 drug searches in 2008 and 9, and 288,000 convictions. These include cannabis notifications and so on, which means that the police are spending an awful amount of time policing drugs, and particularly that kind of time what we're worried about, because we're always saying that the police are spending too much time on paperwork and we have to get them out of the back office and on the beat. But when they are on the beat, they seem to be spending a lot of time arresting or searching people for drug-related offences and could be released for doing things that are perhaps more socially constructive. When all in all, the savings have been estimated to be something like 23.6 billion that could be achieved, or that is currently being spent on policing the Misuse of Drugs Act. So that money could be saved. And what about the tax take? I mean, this is, again, something where we're just speculating wildly. In the Netherlands, where we have a decriminalized cannabis market, it is estimated that the tax take is something like 400 million euros. The Netherlands has roughly a quarter of the population of the UK. Their cannabis prevalence rates are slightly lower than here, so you can sort of easily quadruple that. So we have a sort of a hefty new income stream for the exchequer of 1.5 million perhaps, and we're making savings of 22 million. So there are extraordinary advantages to be had. There are two reservations that I want to build in. First, there is of course going to be a sharp increase in consumption. It's one of the interesting observations that we come out with when we look at the whole sort of methadone and legal high market, that people do actually like to have something where they feel safe, and when it's safely available, they're more likely to try it. And we should sort of, in all reasonableness, expect an increase in consumption. And with that, there will be a reconfiguration of medical complications that go with taking mind-altering substances. And secondly, while the legal market will, of course, absorb most drug-related activities, there will always be some sort of underground market, just as you have trafficking in hand-rolled tobacco, for instance, in order to dodge income taxes or import tariffs. The interesting thing when you're talking about regulated markets, we're always using that term regulated as opposed to the current vocabulary, which is controlled, a controlled market. But it isn't. There's nothing controlled about the market at the moment. The only thing that's controlled is the substance and the person who is in possession of the substance, i.e. they will be arrested. Otherwise, there's no government intervention in the way that the market is configured at all. It's a completely uncontrolled market. And that's why we're trying to regulate it. And the regulation, the argument for regulation comes from the fact that it is so widespread. And we will believe that most people are interested in maintaining within the law. It's no longer a countercultural expression of revolt, as it was perhaps in the 60s. Most drug use nowadays is fairly normalized. And this regulated framework allows us, therefore, the opportunity to introduce a number of harm-reducing or protective measures. Next slide, please. And the first would be, for instance, we wouldn't restrain or restrict advertising to avoid the explosion that, for instance, was accompanied in cigarette consumption once it was heavily marketed in the beginning of the 20th century. We can control the strength of substances, as was discussed earlier, with reference to alcohol. We can do the same with the THC levels on cannabis, or also the content of various powder forms. We can check substances for their purity, for their strength, and we could, for instance, talk about the location of places where these drugs are sold or open for consumption. Should they be within schools or within certain residential neighborhoods? But it's really something that could be decided at local level, very much like the coffee shop policy in the Netherlands at the moment. And when it comes to the introduction of a regulated market, it could also be phased, so that you start out with certain substances like coca leaves and cannabis and mushrooms, and a few years later with amphetamine and LSD and so on. So you phase it in. And if you look, for instance, at what happened when alcohol prohibition was repealed in the early 30s, 1933, I believe, it didn't mean that suddenly alcohol became widely available. There was a joke which said, remember the old days before prohibition when you couldn't buy a drink on Sunday? After you have a market that is regulated, it might in some ways be more difficult to obtain substances because the illicit supply networks have disappeared. They have been replaced. But we need to recognize that by removing this system of punishments and penalties is in itself unprecedented, and it's impossible to predict what the effect on human behavior and patterns of consumption will be. But the experience from countries like the Netherlands or parts of California, where, for instance, you have widely available cannabis supplies, is that these countries do not fall over the edge. They don't become dysfunctional. And we also realize that the public by now is far more experienced and risk-aware when it comes to these substances than they were before. But there are other costs of regulation which I think we need to be aware of and that have to be factored in and prepared for. Because the war of drugs is, of course, a phony war. There's no real enemy that can ever be defeated and the war therefore be concluded. But it's a war where there are lots of casualties. And just as there are casualties, there are lots of beneficiaries in the camps of drug warriors. We have an international drug control system and a national drug control bureaucracy that has a deeply vested interest in maintaining it. There are also foot soldiers right across the whole array of law enforcement agencies, but also in the treatment systems that depend on the classification of substances as being illegal. And then the question is, what do you do with these people in their transition period, before drugs become regulated? And this is quite ironic, because so far the debate has very much been what will happen to organized crime groups once drugs are legalized? What will they do? They will do new terrible things that we have to be afraid of. I don't think so. I think crime is very much opportunistic. People respond to opportunity, and if the opportunity is no longer there, they'll do something else, be it legal or illegal. People are not born criminals. The real problem is, what do you do with the various armies that are fighting the drugs war at the moment? What you need is some sort of transition strategy, some sort of demobilization, like you do at the end of conflict. And I think that's what we sort of need to take our models from. And you could say, for instance, that there would be an increase in treatment demand and drug prevention business, at least for the treatment sector and the prevention officers. Law enforcement would have to be detailed to other activities, which again, as numbers are being reduced, I suppose this is a good moment. And I think the saying in the Obama administration was never waste a good crisis. And I think, since we have a financial crisis, this is the time to make these cutbacks and therefore to reassign law enforcement to different duties. The question, I suppose, is, are these all imaginary scenarios? I mean, how likely is it that we will ever really dismantle the control system? And we have to really engage with three constituencies that are maintaining this discussion on drug control. Policymakers, law enforcement, and healthcare professionals. Each has a different role. One is to tell us that drugs are dangerous, the other is to tell us that drugs cause crime, and the policymakers are telling us that something's being done about it. So what we need to understand is that this is a system that we're working with. Not a system in the sense that it's functional as a rational system. It's a system in an ontological sense. It exists mainly for its own perpetuation. And understanding that, I think, is the first way to realize, to change it. Because we have to come up with a new paradigm. Not a war paradigm, not a drugs is bad paradigm, but a paradigm around consumer protection and public health that looks at drugs as things that need to be regulated. And the question is, when is this going to happen? Well, we have to work on it, and we have to carry on working on it until we reach this tipping point. And we can again look at the US history from alcohol prohibition, where I think it was in 1930, when the man Morris Shepherd, who was the senator who drafted the Volstead Act, he was asked about the likelihood about the 18th Amendment being repealed. And he said, there's as much chance of repealing the 18th Amendment as there is of a hummingbird to fly to Mars with the Washington Monument tied to its tail. And 3 years later, the saloons opened their doors again.